Okay, welcome everyone to the Flash Forum on the cost of living. Thank you very much all for coming. I'm Beth Webster, the Director of the Melbourne Institute. And before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we work, live and learn, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we would pay our respects to their elders past, present and future, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. Now, I should use a microphone, shouldn't I, Myron? Because of there's about 50 people, 60 people online. So the sudden rise in the polls of One Nation has really focused our attention on wages, costs and living standards. But this lacklustre growth of low-wage incomes is not new and has been going on, and Labor economists have known this for a long time. In fact, in the US, where the situation is a bit worse, I think the median wage has not grown in real terms since 1979. In Australia, the data we have, which only goes back 15 years, shows that a very low rate of increase in low wages. Both the wages are low and the rate of increase is low compared with top wages. So people at the top end of the wage distribution had real wage increases of 2% a year, which is sort of just above productivity increases. At the bottom end, the bottom 10% wages are only growing by less than 1% a year. So, this has really, I guess, become more apparent in the media and discussions because of the jolts in energy prices caused by both the Ukraine war and the Middle Eastern war. So this is possibly, even though this is an underlying issue for some time, this is possibly why now it's become topical and people are really interested in the broader media. So today we're going to hear from 10 experts who are going to bring different perspectives to this topic. Some people are going to talk about how we got here, some people are going to talk about how we might get out of this situation, and others are going to just talk about what the outlook is probably going to be over the coming years. And the speakers include, first of all, we're going to have Dr. Medo Purnada, who's a supply chain expert from the University of Melbourne. Associate Professor Sam Tsiaplis from the Melbourne Institute. He's a macroeconomist. He's online because he's unwell today. Mr. Paul Bloxham, who is the Chief Economist from ANZ for HSBC. He is online. Professor Roger Wilkins, who many of you will know, who's the co-director of HILDA, who'll also be speaking. Dr. Diane Crowell from the Monash Business School from Monash University. Dr. Gianna LaCava, who's a research director at E61, he is online. Now, Professor Matthew Greenwood Nimmo is unwell today, and in his place is the Deputy Director of the Macroeconomics Program at Melbourne Institute. So we have Associate Professor Viet Nguyen. Mr. Mark Chambers from the Reserve Bank in the Melbourne office. Ms. Diana Musina, Chief Economist from AMP, who is online. And finally, we'll finish up with Professor Alan Fels, who is a former ACCC chair and is currently a honorary professor at Melbourne University. So each presentation is going to be 5 minutes, just to make the presentations short, snappy and very focused. At 4 minutes 30, Myron will give a little ring on the bell to just let you know. The event is going to be recorded. Audience members online won't be seen or heard, but they can submit a question in the chat to be read out. Professor John Deneu will read out those questions. Those in the room will be heard during Q&A. Also, to our online audience, please note that while you will be able to see the speakers during their presentations, you will not be clearly visible online here. So, and also, in case I forget, please stay afterwards. A light lunch will be provided. So I'll hand over to Medo. And speakers, can you use the microphone for people online? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Medo Purnada, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Business and Economics. And what I'm going to share with you today is about my research in Australian food supply chains that I've been conducting for some time following the inquiry into price gouging, and how it's relevant to cost of living crisis. So here you see the consumer price index in Australia reported in April, 4.2%, which is not great. Now, the major contributing factors to this CPI are housing, transport, food and beverage. Now, these are barely any luxurious items. These are day-to-day cost of living that we cannot avoid. And usually when a cost of living crisis happens, most of us look at the consumer side of it, obviously. But what we usually do not acknowledge is that housing, transport, and food and beverage has got a supply chain behind it. In fact, they're very supply chain intensive. And those cost pressures that navigate through supply chains, actually the outcome of those cost pressures are seen at the end of it, which is at the consumer side. Now, what's happening in the supply chain is what I do. And I would like to draw your attention into the supply chain governance that is going on, at least in Australian food supply chains, that I'm going to share with you. First, I would like to pose this question, that the key question is not only why are prices rising, but how are these cost pressures being transmitted, absorbed, shifted, or amplified before they reach the households? And that is where supply chains come in. So from left-hand side of this picture, well, a cost pressure in supply chains happens where a cost shock occurs, like the Strait of Hormuz closure. Now, a fuel cost here would reverberate through Australian supply chains, but it doesn't go through these supply chains evenly. So supply chains are relationships between firms. Some firms are more powerful than the others. So what happens to those weaker, more vulnerable suppliers? Usually those are the ones that absorbs those cost pressures more because they have contractual dependence because of the power imbalances in the supply chain. So the little suppliers, the weaker suppliers, are the ones that are getting squeezed more. Now, what happens, for example, in food supply chain, where those suppliers are getting squeezed by powerful, for example, supermarkets or powerful buyers? Well, my research shows that some of them go first through some range thinning. What is range thinning here? It is fewer products and less innovation. I put less innovation in my farming agricultural activities. Now, if again these cost pressures accumulate, what will happen next? The next one is descaling. I will reduce my capacity. I will reduce my service to regional supply chains. I will reduce my reach. Last but not least, as these pressures accumulate, supplies then exit from the supply chains, as happens to considerable number of suppliers in food and agriculture these days. So when these supplies exit, what happens? You might think that it is only a firm level issue, but no. The end consumers are going to have less choices. The end consumers are going to pay more prices. So you'll see how these are connected to each other. One other thing that I would like to mention, and that comes from my recent visit to regional Victoria and Western side, is that this burden is not evenly distributed between consumers either. So consumers from regional communities, low-income household, and consumers with fewer alternatives are getting squeezed the most as well. So if you go to Western Victoria, if you go to many small regional towns, they don't have Woolworths or Coles. They are dealing with IGAs, and the prices of fresh food and vegetables is very high. Some people cannot afford it. So some people in our regional Victoria, for example, do not have access to fresh. So what should policy do, and what should policymakers also include within their policymaking and decision-making? I recommend three options here. First things is to monitor supplier distress. Look for the signals where the supplies in your supply chain are at distress. What are those signals? Track signs such as product delisting, reduced regional service, insolvency risk, late payments, and so on. The second one is that we do not have to look into all supply chains for a cost of living crisis. Transport, housing, food and beverage. Let's focus on those first. And let's look at the suppliers, critical suppliers, small and weak suppliers that are at distress. Last but not least, we need to look into the power and fairness within our supply chains, the suppliers that are getting squeezed. So to me, cost of living crisis is not just about a macroeconomic issue or a household budget issue. It's also about a supply chain governance issue. So if we look at just the prices at the end of the supply chain, we are not going to include how the cost of reducing inflation is getting borne by suppliers. Now, I would like to close by saying that the goal should not only be lowering inflation, it should be lowering inflation with better resilience, access, and equity. Thank you very much.
Okay, is that all? Is that clear? Can you guys all see this? Okay. So let me just start by apologizing for not being able to be present in person. Unfortunately, I've come down with a cold, so I'm going to do this online. I'm going to start by looking at, I guess, the heterogeneity of realized inflation across different household types. So we know that inflation has increased. So you can see in this top slide, whether you use the ABS monthly measures or the inflation gauge, which is produced by the Melbourne Institute and comes out a bit earlier, both measures are pointing to inflationary pressure. But one of the nuances that you can't identify just by using headline or even underlying measures is how these inflationary pressures differentiate across households. So in the bottom figure, I'm looking at inflation or cost of living pressures across different household types. So you can see that in, I guess, late 2022, early 23, employees had a marginally higher inflationary pressure. Now, as interest rates fell, that pressure declined, and so the pressure on the types of households that are subject to interest rates, that declined. Okay. And in recent months, we've seen, I guess, a reversal of that property. So employee inflation has increased. But an interesting property that's a bit different to what happened, say, a few years ago, is that even though the trajectory of employee inflation has increased faster than other households, so employees are still marginally experiencing lower inflation than other types of households. And that's because there's a broader base of inflationary pressure in recent months. And so it's not just about interest rates. It's about interest rates, energy prices, and a whole bunch of other factors. And so the type of heterogeneity that we observed a few years back is different to what we're observing now. But one of the interesting takeaways is that these things move hand in hand, I guess. So all households are experiencing an increase in pressure, albeit at different rates. So that's looking at realized prices. This slide is going to do something different. It's going to look at what people think will happen. So these are the inflation expectations of households, what they think will happen to prices in the next 12 months. So just to show you how that's changed, the top figure looks at the distribution of inflation expectations across different bins, across 3 different periods. So the blue bar is pre-COVID, red is during the, I guess, the period of peak inflation expectations. So in mid-2022, we experienced very, very high inflation expectations, and the green bar is now. So what we can discern fairly readily is that we've seen a shift from the very far right tail So you can see in terms of the number of households reporting 9 to 10% or greater than 10% inflation. Okay, so that's declined, but it's still higher than it was pre-COVID. Now, what we have seen is a shift from that far right tail to, I guess, a more moderate level of inflation. So in this 4-5% band, we can see that the green bar is greater than the red or the blue. So that, I guess, speaks to lower, broader inflationary pressure. But an interesting property is that if you look at the bottom figure, the proportion or the share of respondents expecting inflation to go up is actually higher now than it was in that peak 2022 period. So what we've seen is a shift in the distribution from the far right tail to the middle of the distribution. Okay, so that 4-5% range. But we've also seen a pickup in the proportion of consumers expecting higher prices. So that's a little unusual. And I guess it validates the stance of tightening interest rates, because if you've got a broad consensus of higher inflation expectations, and that suggests that people are, I guess, less inclined to report don't know. Okay. So what's happened here is that the proportion of respondents that report don't know has declined. So we've got less uncertainty about the path of inflation. It's higher, but it's not as high as it was before. Okay. This chart is going to look at real wage expectations. Okay, so what I've done is I've constructed real wage expectations for different job types. Because these expectations are often, I guess, subject to certain biases, I've centered them by removing the overall average. So when you see something above zero, that means real wage expectations are above average, and below zero is below average. The interesting property is that in recent months, all occupational types have recorded a sharp decline in real wage expectations. So even the households that are typically most optimistic and have higher real wage expectations, in other words, the managers and professionals, who tend to have higher wage expectations and lower inflation expectations, and so therefore greater real wage expectations, even that group that has been persistently above all other occupation groups has now entered the below average territory. So across the entire spectrum, we've seen this, I guess, this increase in pessimism and this sharp decline in beliefs about what real wages will do in the next 12 months. So the reason I'm showing you this is because insofar as one of the reasons for hiking rates is the need to ameliorate the pass-through from inflation to wages. Okay, so the need to offset that channel. That doesn't seem to be a factor that's particularly pertinent right now. Okay, so real wage expectations are clearly below average for almost all occupational types. So any need to hike up rates for the purpose of, I guess, constraining that pass-through doesn't seem to be a valid reason right now. And I'm going to end it with this slide. So this is looking at real wage expectations across the pseudo life cycle. Okay, so different age groups. So even there, we see that common pattern of heavily falling real wage expectations in recent times. So the older cohort, age 50 plus, who have a weaker wage trajectory. So that is very heavily negative. It's very close to the negative real wage expectations that we observed in 2022. But even the typically most optimistic cohort, the age 25-34, which has higher typical wage growth than the other groups, even that is falling and is only slightly below average right now. So I guess I'll end it there.
Right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. My name is Paul Bloxham. I at HSBC Bank, and from what I can work out, the only large foreign bank on the call. So I'm going to focus on one area which is my speciality. I cover Australia and New Zealand, but I'm also the chief economist at HSBC for global commodities. And so I'm going to focus on the nature of the shock that we're currently facing in the form of the Middle East conflict and how we are thinking about what's likely to happen going forward, and how we can sort of frame that in terms of its implications, how long it might go on for, and so on. Obviously, in the introductory remarks, we've had a number of global shocks, not just this one, of course, with the COVID shock, and then we followed up with the Russia-Ukraine war and the inflation shock that came off the back of the reopening, and now we've got another in the form of the Middle East conflict. And it seems clear that we're going to be dealing with perhaps more regular negative supply shocks from the rest of the world. And this is going to be a key feature of how we think about cost of living challenges. In terms of the current shock, I think the first remark would be some of the more pessimistic observers who suggested that the oil price might go much higher, $150, $200 a barrel, we haven't seen that play out that way, at least not so far. And I guess we should start off by sort of trying to explain how it is that we haven't gotten there. I think the disruptive effect of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which is the primary thing we're talking about, has come into a global commodity market that has been very well stocked. And so the US has had strategic reserves that they've been able to run down. China has had very, very high strategic reserves for oil in particular. There's been investment going on around the world in gas capacity, such that we thought going into all of this prior to the event that actually the world would have a surplus of liquefied natural gas coming into 2027. We've had 2 good growing seasons globally as well. And so grain stocks have been high, grain prices have been low coming into all of this. And so in some ways that's been a helpful feature. But there is no getting around that closing the Strait of Hormuz is a huge disruption to global commodity supply chains, and is, I think, going to have an extended effect. It's already having a large effect. The longer it goes on, the more of an effect it's going to have. And I think the thing we're writing most vividly about at the moment is if it continues for much longer, that we might start to get to sort of low levels of inventories across a range of commodities that start to see perhaps non-linearity showing up in terms of price performance, sort of tipping points where inventories get to such low levels that actually at some point you start to see genuine shortages and price spikes that are a bit clearer. Obviously, this starts with the premise that there is a great deal of uncertainty about whether and when and how the Strait of Hormuz will be reopened. It's clearly been closed now for 3 months. There are a handful of ships getting through each day, but the normal traffic through the Strait of Hormuz was 120 to 140 tankers and ships. And we're talking about, a handful getting through each on a daily basis at the moment. Clearly, if you're watching a news flow, which is my job, you can see that this is ongoing with even more conflict happening just in the last few hours and over the weekend and so on. It is hard to see it resolved quickly, but the longer it goes on for, the more disruptive it's likely to be. Just to run through some quick stats that I carry around, 20% of the world's oil used to track through the Strait of Hormuz on a normal day prior to the 28th of February, about 20% of the world's gas as well. We have a lot of focus on those two, but of course there are other commodities that come out of the Middle East as well. 35% of the world's fertilizer, particularly urea, comes out of the Middle East. That's a huge proportion of the global supply of fertilizer. Sulfur, 25% of the world's sulfur comes from the Middle East. Sulfur is a key input into the production of fertilizer, semiconductors, and also the processing of metals like copper and nickel. And aluminium. 9% of the world's aluminium comes out of the Middle East as well. It's currently all heavily constrained by the closure of the strait. The reason why we've seen the oil price sitting at $95 a barrel at the moment rather than anything higher, and why it peaked at 125 rather than something higher, as I say, has been large inventories built up. And one of the ways I think you can square all this away is in recent times we've seen the Americans boost their exports, in part because they're running down strategic reserves. They've boosted their exports by about 3 million barrels a day, from 6 to 9 million barrels a day, by about 3 million barrels a day. And China has equivalently reduced its imports by about 3 million barrels a day. It's slowed down its refinery rates and it's drawing down on its own reserves as well. That gives you 6 million barrels a day back. We've had about 7 or 8 million barrels a day that's been redirected that would normally go through the strait through pipelines. And that's left us with a small missing bit, and that is what we'd call demand destruction. So 14 million barrels a day, about 6 million barrels a day out of inventories, about 7 or 8 million barrels a day that have come from redirection. We've got a small missing bit. But as you can probably appreciate, the further those inventories run down in China and the US, the more likely it is we might hit some tipping points. Just a couple of other quick themes. I guess one thematic in all of this for me is there are going to be distributed lags in the sense that this is not all just showing up right now. Things like the fertilizer constraint that we see means less fertilizer on crops, which means lower agricultural yields in the coming season, which is why you're starting to see some of the agricultural prices, grain prices are rising, partly for that, partly because of concerns about the weather and an oncoming El Nino as well. But I think, it's not over yet. I think the other thing would be, even if the strait was to reopen quickly soon, you'd say it will take time to adjust and for ships to get through. It will also be, I think, a period where you'd likely see restocking by countries. If they've been running down their inventories heavily, at the point where they can access more supply, they'll seek to restock. And so that will leave us with elevated prices of oil and so on. I think another feature of this will be that the shock itself is likely to motivate countries to focus more on energy security and fertilizer security as well, to some degree, not just driving them to restock, but also in all likelihood sort of making them focus more on the energy transition, where they can have more sovereign control over their energy supplies, and that in turn is supporting demand and the prices of things like copper and nickel and aluminium and all of the energy transition related metals. So, I've been describing this sort of overall to my client base as a super squeeze rather than a super cycle. Its commodity prices have gone up about 25% since the beginning of the year, the global aggregate. They're sitting comfortably at that level. They're not coming down seemingly, but it's pretty close to a pure negative supply shock. Its biggest effect is likely to be on Asia, because that's where most of the commodities typically that comes through the Strait of Hormuz are on their way to, and it's going to have a bigger effect obviously on lower income countries than higher income countries, because higher income countries have got more access to reserves and more ability to go to the global market and buy and pay any price, it seems, for in a lot of ways for commodities. So this shock is still ongoing. It isn't over yet. It is having a big effect already, and I think that it's going to have a sort of an effect that plays out over a longer period of time. So I know that's not all great and positive news, but I think that's the nature of the sorts of challenges we face, that the world delivers obviously has delivered more regular negative supply shocks, and we've got to find ways to adjust to it, which is obviously the topic of this Flash Forum. I'll stop because I've used 8 minutes rather than 5. That was not intentional, but I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to pick up on a theme that was touched on by both Meadow and Sam, and that's to do with the distribution of cost of living increases. Obviously, it's not necessarily the case that that everyone's equally affected but by the rising cost of living, and so it's valuable to look at these distributional dimensions. But I'm going to take a somewhat different approach. And actually, before I do get into the distributional issues, I kind of want to set the scene a little bit with a depiction of what we can call the crisis. So this is comparing, in a cumulative fashion, the consumer prices and wages, but after tax wages. So obviously, it's not just prices that matter, it's also what's happening to incomes. Of course, only looking at wages means it's not taking into account non-wage forms of income, and of course also the effects of interest rates on things like mortgage repayments are not captured here. But the reason I wanted to show this first, though, is that it really shows that the gulf between prices and wages really sort of took off between December 2021 and December 2023. In 2024-25, we can see there that the stage 3 tax cuts actually did quite a bit to I guess, improve the situation in terms of mitigating the greater growth of prices than wages. Although, and since then we are starting to see again the gap widening since then. But one of the reasons I wanted to present that is because I'm going to look at Hilda analysis, and the most recent Hilda data I have is for the 2023-24 financial year, and so I guess I'm sort of saying that this is looking at that period from sort of December 21 to December 23 is a pretty valuable period to look at, because that's when the rise in the cost of living in terms of prices relative to wages was greatest. So as I've been mentioning, you kind of have to look at both what's happening on the price side, but also what's happening on the income side. Obviously one way people do that is to look at real wages, but that real wages only has a loose, a strong but still rather loose connection to incomes. So here I've got three measures of real income or changes in them between 21, 22 and 23, 24. So the first one is just a standard sort of income measure after net of taxes and benefits. And so we see there that the mean decreased by 2.4%. In real terms, and the median actually increased by 0.8%. The second measure there essentially takes out housing costs. So it's capturing the effects of interest rate rises on mortgage repayments. Also, if rent prices have moved differentially to the overall price level, it captures that. And so you can see there that we're getting a more negative effects on or changes in incomes. And then the last one there is kind of a bottom line measure, which is saying, well, what income do you have left over after your non-discretionary expenditures are met? So these are things that are difficult to adjust in the short run. They tend to be thought of as things you need to maintain your current living arrangements, and that, as I said, are somewhat difficult to change in the short run. And there we can see quite a sizable decline in that measure of income, of what you've got left over after you've met all your non-discretionary requirements, and that the mean decreased by 8.3% and the median by 6.5%. So then going on to distributional dimensions. So here I'm looking at changes in these three income measures by 6 household types. And there's a lot of numbers there, but I guess I would direct you sort of perhaps attention mainly to the last column there, where you can see for the sort of the 4, what you might call working age household types, we're getting in the order of sort of 9 to 10% declines in their real income after they've met their non-discretionary expenditure. So that's a real significant change over a 2-year period, so showing real significant bite there. And what also stands out there is that essentially retiree households saw their incomes net of non-discretionary expenditures actually rise by about 6%. Unsurprisingly, when you look at it by your housing situation, when you look at this bottom line measure, it's mortgage owners with a mortgage have the biggest declines in their expenditure net of non-discretionary expenditures, but it's also quite large for renters, because they were coming off a low base because rents actually came down during the COVID period, and so then rents rose more sharply than the overall price level, and that effect is being picked up there. But outright owners, though, which is again, is not unrelated to what we're seeing for the older households who have high rates of outright home ownership, that they've actually had a slight increase in their incomes net of non-discretionary expenditures. And then getting, I guess, to the pointy end in terms of how does this play out over people by their location in the income distribution. You can see that actually when you look at just the household equivalised disposable income, the standard income measure, it's almost a reverse ordering, that we're finding that the top is sort of the distribution has actually been faring worse. Obviously, again, they're coming from a higher base; they're better able to absorb price rises. But it's perhaps sort of contrary to some of the narratives, and it reflects the fact that benefits tend to be indexed to inflation. We had some increases in Commonwealth rent assistance, and then what happens at the top is you have bracket creep is really probably one of the main sources of their greater declines in relative income. So you have fiscal policy actually acting in this contractionary way for higher income earners in a way that's not captured by sort of looking at just average weekly earnings measures, unless you're also taking into account its interaction with the tax system. But then when you get to the bottom line in terms of household income net of non-discretionary expenditures, the overwhelming impression is that it's actually quite broadly distributed. The burden of this rise in the cost of living is actually fairly evenly distributed across the income distribution, but for different reasons. There's different factors at play depending on where you are in the income distribution. So just to sort of sum up, there is clear evidence of bite. We're talking about incomes net of non-discretionary income sort of falling over 2 years by about 10%. But the burden of this has been quite broadly felt. Of course, as I mentioned, the ability to absorb that sort of decline in your income differs by where you started from. So high income earners are obviously better able to absorb that. But also the other thing that stands out is that retirees, they stand out as faring relatively well. And I guess the open question is, well, do these findings persist to the present day, 2 years later? So in 2024, we had moderation in inflation. The stage 3 tax cuts, as I showed, played an important role in mitigating the cost of living rise. And we also had some pickup in nominal wage growth. But since then, we've had inflation pick up again. The RBA cash rate is right back where it was in 2023-24, and also the gains from the stage 3 tax cuts have been significantly eroded by bracket creep. So I'd say there's good reasons to think that these findings from this 2-year window in the immediate post-COVID period probably hold pretty well in the current environment.
My name is Diane Krall from Department of Business Law and Taxation at Monash University, the business school there. I've been asked to comment on tax settings given the current cost of living pressures, particularly in relation to the energy sector. My academic expertise covers taxation, particularly the PRRT, also known as the gas tax. Since 2012, I've published about 15 peer-reviewed publications in law journals as well as blogs on the need to understand and reform the gas tax. My view is that any additional revenue raised by the gas tax should be used to provide cost of living relief to Australian households and businesses. Now, there have been 2 inquiries into the gas tax, and I'll refer to it as the gas tax. First of all, the 2017 Callaghan inquiry that I put in a submission to. I met with Peter Callaghan, and I also presented to the Senate at the time when the report came out. The most recent inquiry into the gas tax was the one in April, and basically it was a select committee on the taxation of gas. The inquiry there had a range of terms of references, but 2 actually have piqued my interest. First of all, the term with regard to the alternate tax arrangements for oil and gas production and export, and also how any additional gas revenue generated could be used to provide cost of living relief for households and businesses and reduce our dependence on imported fuel. This April inquiry received over 230 public submissions, and although I did not put in a submission this time to the inquiry, my published work has been cited in quite a number of the 2026 submissions. Essentially, my stance is unchanged, and I continue to call for a removal of the low revenue raising PRRT and to reintroduce the ad valorem system of royalties to be applied to the market value of the production of oil and gas in projects that are essentially these days off the coast of West Australia. So we're talking about projects such as the North West Shelf, Gorgon, Wheatstone, Ichthys, and so on. With regard to the 2026 inquiry into the gas tax, what was interesting was that they didn't put up recommendations. Instead, they put up a range of views. And 3 of their views that have been published in their May report have again caught my eye. So first of all, the committee stated that it had received substantial evidence that Australians want to receive a fair return on their gas resources. In my view, this is so important, and it aligns with a view put out by the eminent economist Joseph Stiglitz, who visited Australia in 2024 and raised the question on national TV as to why Australia is giving away its resources. He found it actually mind-boggling. He said, and I agree, that if Australia made fossil fuel companies pay for the value of the resources they extract and their fair share of taxes, we wouldn't be in this position of a cost of living crisis. And of course, yes, he was referring to our cost of living crisis. The second view that the committee in April put out was that it finds a lack of timely, transparent, entity-level data available, specifically from the ATO, in order to give us a shared understanding of revenue, profits, and PRRT liabilities. Now, to my mind, we don't need a plethora of data at this stage. We are at a crisis. We only need to consider 3 key figures. First of all, the low $1.4 billion expected to be raised in the PRRT in the next financial year, and this was in the figures put out by the budget in May. We actually get more in the beer excise tax, 2.7 billion. So 1.4 compared to 2.7. The second figure you should be aware of are the carried forward, not yet deducted expenses available to the gas industry. It is currently 282 billion. So in other words, 282 billion of revenue has to be raised or generated by the industry before any more PRRT is paid. And the third figure that you should be aware of, and this is a comparative figure, and I'm looking to the 35 billion that was raised in 2025 by Norway through their special tax on revenue from the oil and gas industry. So those are the only 3 figures you need to bear in mind in order to make an informed decision. And finally, the committee was not able to put out this view that it was not able to reach agreement on a set of recommendations for Australia's approach to the taxation of its gas resources. For this inquiry, there were strong calls for a 25% gas exports levy. There were calls for the Norwegian-style special tax on gas, and also calls for government participation in the form of equity in the Australian petroleum industry. I don't agree with any of them. Onshore minerals in Australia are taxed under a uniform royalty system by Australian state governments. The same model that is at least revenue raising should also apply to all our gas projects offshore of WA in Commonwealth waters. Thank you very much.
Hey everybody, I think it's me next.
Yes.
Oh, awesome. And hopefully you can see the slides. Sorry, I realize I'm wasting time just talking about this, but thanks to everyone for having me. Sorry I can't be there in person. It's exciting to be part of my first Flash Forum, even though it's slightly stressful trying to get it all done in 5 minutes. Let me give you a very quick and hot take on the cost of living crisis. I'm going to focus on one particular issue up on the screen here, which is trying to understand the consumer sentiment puzzle. And by that, I mean, why is everyone feeling really bad? When you look at consumer sentiment surveys, they're at half-century lows. I think we just saw from the Westpac Melbourne Institute survey yesterday, and yet the real economy is holding up. It's okay. Labour market we know has been pretty good for some time. It is weakening, but it's been pretty good. Real incomes are growing. Real spending is growing as well. So what's going on? Given the theme of the Flash Forum, you won't be surprised to learn that the answer I'm going to suggest is it's the cost of living. So hopefully you can see this picture, which the RBA and others have shown before, which is showing the correlation between consumer sentiment and real household spending. So sentiment's the blue line and spending growth is the orange line. You can see they kind of track each other pretty closely over history, and then sort of post-COVID, a big gap has emerged, and that's the bit that I'm calling the puzzle. Like, why has sentiment fallen off a cliff while spending has continued to grow? And for those that have previously worked at the RBA or currently work at the RBA, you will probably know that pretty much every year there would be an internal research note trying to understand the link between sentiment and consumer spending. Does it lead? Does it lag? Does it tell you anything? And we typically conclude that maybe tells you something, but doesn't really tell you a lot. But one thing that's interesting that I can't recall from any of those studies is actually looking at the link between sentiment and what's going on with inflation. And I'll turn to that on the next slide, which is actually showing two panels. On the top, we've got sentiment in the sort of dark green line, and we've got inflation as the orange line. And I've inverted inflation so you can see the correlation a little bit better. So when it's going down, inflation is actually rising. And then I've got the US plotted similarly on the bottom panel. And hopefully you can see that there's a pretty good negative correlation between these two things. So when inflation's high, sentiment is low. And as I say, I can't recall us ever sort of looking at that correlation in the past when I was at the RBA. And I think it's part of the explanation for what's going on now. So when we turn to some really simple time series models, looking at the correlation between sentiment and indicators of the real economy, so the unemployment rate, spending growth, income growth, and then you add inflation in. Inflation does do a decent job of adding explanatory power to these models, and it can explain roughly about a third of what we've seen in the post-COVID period in terms of explaining that gap. So it's not the smoking gun, but I do think there is something to be said for the fact that it's not just the rate of inflation that matters, but actually the price level. And it's kind of hard to capture in these models. That we've seen a really sustained pickup in inflation, and particularly over a period that people really haven't seen a lot of inflation. So yes, sentiment fell and prices rose a lot during the 1970s, and you see that in the data. But this period stands out, and I think it could be because people kind of got used to fairly low inflation. So this period's been quite stark for them. But that's a little bit speculative. One other thing I just wanted to flag, and this is a blatant bit of self-promotion for some E61 work, but when we break up, well, we constructed some new measures of the CPI, or cost of living indices, for different housing tenures, so for renters, mortgagors, and outright owners. So some of you may know the ABS does produce cost of living indices for pensioners and wage and salary earners, but they don't actually produce these indicators by housing tenure. And I'm using a new methodology, which I won't have time to go into, but it's called the opportunity cost method that was developed by Erwin Dewart to build these measures. And one way of sort of pointing that out is to note that I've got outright owners here shown on this figure, and they have a cost of housing, which is maybe a bit surprising. They don't have a cash outlay in terms of paying rent or paying a mortgage, but they have an opportunity cost that they could sell their home and rent, and they could, and rent out their current home. And so there's that sort of opportunity cost, which is captured in these measures, as well as things like house price growth and mortgage interest payments. I've thrown it all in here. Now, I do a lot of work, and then it ends up that we've got a whole bunch of lines that all kind of look the same. It is true that mortgagors have experienced an increase in the cost of living post-COVID by more than everyone else, but they all kind of track each other closely, which I think is also important from an RBA communication standpoint, that yes, people are feeling the cost of living differentially, but overall, I think that the headline CPI actually kind of captures the lived experience of a lot of people reasonably well. What's interesting, though, as well, is when we bring in some HILDA data and we look at how these cost of living these new measures of inflation by housing tenure, how do they compare to how people are feeling about their financial satisfaction in the Hilda survey, which is plotted on the y-axis, cost of living inflation on the x-axis? Hopefully you can see a decent negative correlation. So when the cost of living is higher, people are feeling worse about their financial satisfaction. This is a fairly robust correlation. And as you will note, and hopefully Melbourne Institute people are proud of me, I am using the Hilda survey here. Apologies that I used the ANZ Roy Morgan survey of consumer sentiment. I didn't have access to the underlying data for that index. So hint, hint, if we could please work together to get that data, that'd be awesome. Thank you. Just in conclusion, we've done this research, I think, is going out tomorrow, this research note that I'm referring to, or possibly early next week. We do a little bit more to show it's not just Australia and the US where this link between inflation and sentiment holds. We see it across an OECD panel. We find some evidence it's not sentiment just responding to the latest inflation print, but there is a kind of cumulative effect that does build over several quarters. We find it is not necessarily due to just salient prices. It's not that people are sort of looking at petrol and groceries and that's the thing that's making them feel bad. And that's probably because the price of everything has gone up. And in terms of the quick sort of policy takeaway, I think there's not a lot to be seen here, sort of what I'm saying, and that sentiment should recover if and when inflation returns to the 2 to 3% target band. But as several people have already hinted, it could be some time before that happens. So thanks, everyone. I think that's it for me. No idea if I got in under 5 minutes, but thanks for having me.
So in my presentation, I'll take a bit different approach. I'll use some survey result. So in a cost of living crisis, people tend to look to the government for support, and like the current one. And there's been some of the cost of living support measures, and potentially there are going to be a few more coming if, the current wars in the Middle East keep going, and then we have more regular, disruptive negative supply shock. Okay. And when design policy option, the government have few alternative, either universals or target one. And in some of the recent cost of living support measure, most of them has been universal, like the fuel excise reduction, electricity rebate, student loan relief. We know the benefit, at the same time, the drawback of these universal policies, right? Perception there may be fairer, but at the same time, they could be more costly for taxpayer. So we did run a survey in order to understand the public opinion around the, backing for universal support measures. And we also want to understand the awareness in terms of the cost of this policy, the tax implication and the perceptions of fairness. So I'll present the first result here. So there's going to be a few dimensions, demographic dimension, but I will focus on two along the life cycle, which is different age cohort and also income bracket. So those are the two most interesting. Okay. So first we want to see the public opinion around universal versus target policy. So we provide different alternative to the consumer. Broad payment to all households, so this is equivalent to the universal support measures. You have the target payment to only low-income household. You have the target payment to only the most vulnerable, and no payment to any household. Okay, so the picture provide the result by different age cohort. Okay, and you can see the overwhelming majorities of consumer in each of the age cohort supported for the target policy to low-income household. Okay, but you also see some generational difference. So you actually have more backing of the target payment to the most vulnerable for the older generation, the Gen X and the Boomer, and these are driven by the low-income household in these two groups. Okay, so these are the people who are in retirement with very moderate retirement income, or approaching retirement, but still very moderate income and moderate like superannuation. Now, in terms of the result by the age, by the income bracket, You can still see the main features, like you have the dominant public backing for the target policy to the low-income household, but you also see some kind of like self-serving bias. You see that you actually have more backing for the target policy to low-income household among the low-income household. But you also see a stronger backing for the broad payment among the higher income household, okay? Because they are more likely to receive it. Okay, so in general, across the age and the income group, you see the strong public backing for the target support policy. Now, in terms of the public awareness of the unnecessary spending or waste when you implement universal measures, right? And so this is one thing that like everyone can agree. I think the majority of consumer in each of the demographic group all agree that if you implement universal cost of living support measures, there are going to be some waste. Like, so you have unnecessary government spending that directed to households that actually donated. Now, in terms of the view about the intertemporal trade-off between spending now and future tax, so I think consumers are quite aware of the potential future tax implication if you implement universal support measures, right? And you actually see that you actually have a higher awareness among the high-income household, and this is probably not that surprising. Now, the last one, this is, one of the key arguments for universal measure going to be the perception of fairness, right? So we ask consumers whether or not they view universal support measures as fair. And I'll draw your attention to the last three columns, which is the aggregate result. And you see that around 40% of the respondents actually think they're fair, but the other 40% actually disagree. So you actually have a split public opinion in terms of whether or not universal support measures are fair or not, right? And this is probably depends on due to the different perceptions of what is fair. For some, maybe universal payment or universal policies is fair, but for the other, maybe directed support to most vulnerable or low-income household is fair. Among the different age cohort, you can actually see the generational difference. So you have a lot more young people actually think the universal payment is fair, but a lot older think they are not fair. Okay, and these are driven by their own circumstances, like high-income household in the younger age group and low-income household in the older age group. Okay, so overall, the finding from the survey show that there is public backing for targeted cost of living support measures. Okay, and if in the months to come, in the years to come, if the cost of living crisis wasn't, and if the government was to design cost of living support measures, if those measures are well designed, well articulated, well communicated, they're going to gain public backing and reduce the waste on government spending and reduce the burdens on the budget. I'll end in here.
Hear me okay? My name is Mark Chambers. I'm from the Reserve Bank's Melbourne office. Let me just do a quick disclaimer. I'm not here to represent or speak on behalf of the Governor or the Reserve Bank Monetary Policy Board. They've got a meeting next week, so I'm sort of deliberately steering clear of specific interest rate decisions that they may be making. But obviously the current environment's one in which they're having to dwell a lot on a lot of the issues that people have been speaking about already. So I found those presentations very helpful and useful, so thank you for that. As a Reserve Bank presentation, I'm going to do something very unusual. I'm only going to speak to one chart. That's this chart here, which hopefully you can all see. This is real household disposable income, growth in that series since the early 1990s, the start of the Reserve Bank's inflation targeting period. This is per capita. So we've just taken the National Accounts measure of household disposable income divided by population. So it hasn't quite adjusted for things like international students and so forth, but it is, we're just trying to strip out the effect of population growth from, household disposable income. And, excuse me. What I want to just talk about is some of the drivers and I guess where the Reserve Bank's been coming from relating to some of the comments that have been made in the presentation. That black series, the line there is the net sort of growth in household disposable income over that period. And you can sort of see it moves around a bit. It's never sort of hugely above zero, but there have definitely been periods where it's sort of been running sort of 3, 4, 5%. Where we are at the moment is pretty sluggish compared to that longer run history. You can see that back in the, say, the 2000s or even the 1990s, it was running sort of, as I said, 3, 4%. Over the 2010s, it was pretty slow, not much above zero. What's been unusual in the last 5 or so years has been that very large dip. It's sort of post-2021, where you saw a very large decline in real disposable income. And so I just want to talk about some of the drivers of that. Looking at the various components sort of shown under the various colours, you can see the stuff above the line. They're the things that are sort of contributing to gross income growth. So the red series that's labour income. So that's everybody, what they're getting paid on average for an individual, on average what's happening through wages, salaries, bonuses, and so forth. And you can see really, I mean, looking at where that red series is at the moment, what it's been doing over in recent years, that sort of labour income on average per household hasn't been too bad compared to the longer run history. Okay, it's possibly not quite as strong as it was in the 2000s, but certainly been a lot stronger than the 2010s and comparable to the 1990s. Similarly, the grey series above that, which is things like sort of financial income, so sort of returns on investments, superannuation, as well as things like government sort of social assistance payments and so forth. That's also been making a decent positive contribution. Again, not as strong as the 2000s, but certainly a lot stronger than the 10 or so years prior to the pandemic. So at least for households on the income side of things, on the sort of that gross income side of things, the last 5 or so years, it doesn't suggest that it's been the income part of the piece that has been weighing on households. Clearly, what you can see in that chart there is that, that single biggest driver, that single biggest drag on real household disposable income has been that dark blue series there. And so that is the impact of aggregate prices in the economy. That measure there is the household, for the aficionados, that's the HFCE deflator out of the national accounts. But that's just measuring that broad impact of price increases on household. You deduct that off the nominal increase in income, and that's what's driving that black line there. And you can see that really where we've been over the last 5 or so years is, unusual really by historical standards. You can see that big drag that was happening over 21, 22 into 23 was much larger than anything we've seen really over the sort of inflation targeting period for the Reserve Bank. And as, Gianni and Sam and Roger and so forth have sort of pointed out that, that period, that saw a big opening up in the gap between sort of wages, sort of income, household income measures, and the prices people are having to pay for goods and services. So, that's something that the Reserve Bank, really that's the primary focus of their monetary policy decision making really over the last few years. I mean, as other commentators have said, monetary policy has been directed at that to try and get that inflation back down to where that target is for sort of 2 to 3%. So, what we've seen over the last few years, that drag has been sort of on average sitting at around 4%, sort of taking away 4% of purchasing power from households sort of on average over the last 5 years. Last few years, that's moderated a bit, but it's still sitting above 3%. The Reserve Bank very much wants to get that down to sort of well below that sort of 3%, sort of sitting at that midpoint of the target band of 2 to 3%. That's been a focus for the Reserve Bank. They continue to iterate that point. We can get into the sort of the trade-offs that might have for the slowing of the economy and what that might mean for some of those other components of that income chart there. But, I think we just can't pretend that it's not the case that sort of impact of inflation on household disposable income has been unusual, has been something that's clearly been dragging on the lived experience of households the last few years, and it's something the Reserve Bank Board is very much focused on in its settings of monetary policy. I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Diana, for those that don't know me, from AMP. I'm going to take more of a positive approach to the previous comments. Not to say that the cost of living crisis isn't over, But I think that we're basically getting to that point that it is probably going to be a thing of the past. So the traditional way that we've been thinking about the cost of living crisis in the past 6 years is that the real wages haven't kept up with inflation, which is something like you can see in this chart here. CPI has gone up by about 25% since 2020, and wages have gone up by 15%. So you get a real wage decline from that point of view. But then if we take into account the total compensation of the total compensation of wages that people have received, which is called the compensation per employee in the national accounts, which is the way that the Reserve Bank also looks at it. And I guess it was in the prior speaker's comments, it was that wage component in the chart that he had. Actually, we're now at the point where total compensation per employee has actually matched up to the increase in CPI. And the difference in the measure between compensation of employees and the wage price index is basically that compensation accounts for churn in the labour market. So when people change jobs and they get a pay rise, that would be reflected in total compensation, whereas the wage price measure is a very it's a sort of a heavy approach to looking at a specific cost of a job. So what is the cost of Diana, the economist, working in this specific role, not Diana, the person who may have traded up and gotten a promotion somewhere else. And because we've had such a tight labour market in the past few years, we're looking at total compensation, I think, makes a lot more sense. Now, of course, this is just looking at the wage component within the cost of living challenge. I think the issues in the past years have been much broader than that. And the other point that I always come back to is that people feel inflation that they don't want to pay for. So what I call the non-fun stuff. So inflation for the essentials. And this is what Roger was talking about as well. So when you take into account the non-discretionary changes in real household income, you sort of see a larger impact, because when you're paying for things like gas, education, construction costs, healthcare, rents, these are all things that you feel quite heavily because you don't want to pay for them. But when you account for, in the very long term, inflation of things like garments or the price of tech, your phone, you can see actually that in the past 10 to 12 years, we've actually seen deflation in those areas. It's just the stuff that people don't want to pay for. And I think that consumers generally have a short time horizon in thinking about what the cost of stuff is, and they sort of conflate prices of things, from maybe they might be thinking, well, the level change in the price of something has gone up by so much, which to them signals that inflation is much more of a problem, even though potential inflation may have been 1% in the past 12 months. Then they may be thinking, well, the prices of these items have actually gone up by so much over a 6-year period. They're thinking about the level change, not necessarily the percentage increase in changes. And that, I think, is driving the divide between consumer sentiment readings and actual consumer spending outcomes, because consumer spending outcomes have actually held up really well. The other issue for consumers, along with some of these issues like the non-fun inflation, is that growth in our economy per person has actually been quite low. So we've been running high levels of population growth, but GDP growth has sort of been on par with that. If our population is running at 1.6% and GDP is somewhere at 2%, which is basically around its potential at the moment, and GDP has been a bit lower than that on average in recent years, we're actually getting low real GDP growth per person. So when you look at household disposable income growth per person, it's actually basically flatlined since 2020 levels. So we had a bit of an uptick in that time, and then it fell, and it's sort of been flatlining since then. And you can see it in the red line here on my chart. So people are feeling like, I think it's the broader feeling like I'm not participating in the gains of the economy, because per person I feel like I've gone backwards. And that goes back to the issue with productivity growth, that if we don't grow our productive capability, if the Australian economy cannot grow at more than 2% without generating inflation, that's going to be a real burden for people's living standards in the future, which is, again, this need to grow productivity in the very long term. So to sum up, I think that the cost of living challenge is actually looking a lot better now. And I think that with the recent changes to the minimum wage awards, and I think a lot of that will be passed to EBAs, we're going to see a re-acceleration in wages growth. We've revised up our wage forecasts because of that. I think there's a big signalling effect in that too. The labour market is still in pretty good conditions, and I think it's going to remain like that because the forward-looking indicators of employment are still looking pretty good. I'm going to end it there, and I will take any questions later on. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to talk briefly about rationing and maybe
Microphone. Alan.
Do you want to use Mark?
Oh, sorry. Oh, there we are. I'm going to talk about rationing, maybe price changes. There is a real possibility, not a probability, but a real possibility there will be some form of fuel rationing in the next few months. It would be more likely if the Middle East conflict continues, especially if the Strait of Hormuz shipping remains closed or largely constrained, if Asian refined fuel exports tighten, shipping insurance costs go up, if there's panic buying, and especially if diesel imports are delayed. And we're vulnerable because we import a lot of all that, and diesel especially is central to freight, mining, farming, emergency services, and food logistics. And we heard from Paul earlier that to some extent we've been living off high stocks and they're running down. Now, against that, rationing may be avoided because shipments are still arriving. The Commonwealth has relaxed its own stockholding reserves, has underwritten extra cargoes, has adjusted fuel standards, coordinated with industry, and has got a 4-part plan that would bring in a little bit of rationing. You might say, well, don't prices do the rationing that you need? I generally work off the idea that elasticity is about 0.2 for oil, so you need very big price increases to have a rationing effect. Well, what does rationing involve? In World War II, every motorist got a coupon entitling them to a few gallons at service stations. But prior to that, essential fuels were provided to farming, to emergency services, to food logistics, and a few others, and not much was left for the ordinary motorist. And in those days, it didn't matter so much because people lived near their shopping, and there were fewer cars, and there was a very positive attitude by the public to the existence of rationing. Were we to bring back World War II rationing, it would be an absolute nightmare, and there'd be far more people claiming they have essential needs. For example, people living a long walk from shopping. But what is likely is that the 1984 liquid fuel emergency legislation would be invoked, and you would get an identification of essential users. By the way, that's a political nightmare, I repeat. And then what's left over would go to the service stations, and diesel would be quite a big issue. Certainly, the lesson from past oil shocks is rationing is politically difficult, administratively clumsy, and there can be panic buying. And that is one of the problems with introducing lesser measures, work from home, lower speed limits, cheaper public transport, carpooling, prioritising freight, reduced non-essential travel. All of them are gradual steps, but every step tends to be associated with offsetting panic buying. So rationing's a contingency. It's not my central forecast, but it could happen if the war and the shortages from the Middle East continue for a while. 2 years out, the market will somehow or other correct, but there could be a very awkward period of shortages in between. Regarding prices, similar sort of story. If there's a demand-supply gap, prices go up very sharply. There will be public dissatisfaction and concern about that. The ACCC has got a lot more money to look at petrol prices, but it's got no actual powers. It used to have some powers over refinery and importer prices. That's gone. I could imagine if the thing is getting out of hand, they'll bring in some legislation which gives the ACCC a tokenistic role in relation to prices. Just finally, about a cost of living crisis, the way I look at it is that prices go up quicker than for essential goods. Prices go up faster than wages. The pressure is on essentials like fuel, electricity, food, rents, and so on, and health services. Then mortgage and interest costs matter a lot. Within that, we also have a housing crisis. And finally, the tax burden is tending to creep up, as we've heard. So all of these elements go into what we call a cost of living crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. It's a fantastic perspective. So we've got 10 minutes at least for questions. I'll ask first if there's a question from the room, and then John, do you have questions online yet? Who's got two? If there's
for 2 questions.
Okay. And then I'll go to the room. First, John.
The first question is from Lachlan Kerwood. Question for the first presenter. Apologies, I missed their name. Would a cash flow tax CFT improve incentives for supply chain investment and disincentive markup inflation? Do we need a more sophisticated ABS-administered central dashboard of supply chain metrics and sectoral demand pressures? And what is your opinion of Professor Isabella Weber's proposal for buffer stocks for critical goods and commodities beyond fuel, example, fertilizer? That was for the first presenter, and that would be Dr. Meadow. Yeah.
Meadow.
I'm trying to work out. Okay, it works. Buffers work sometimes for fresh. We can have for fresh produce, for example, in food supply chains, we can have buffer, and that's for suppliers in certain supplies, like if you're making cabbage or cucumber, all sorts of things. You can store them, you can freeze them. And in my studies, actually, I've noticed that certain supplies are more vulnerable than others. If you're a meat producer, you can freeze it, you can export it, but if you're fresh, you can't. So there are these issues. In terms of fuel storage, in Australia, you probably have seen it on the news that our refineries have reduced. And also, I'm not sure what the policy around it is. Definitely buffers in terms of fuel and essential goods that get into supply chains is necessary. Having said that, we have this agile supply chain versus the supply chains that actually restock essentials, and that is an ongoing debate in order to, if it is not necessary, why would you store it? And that happened exactly during COVID, where we didn't have enough PPEs. Now, one issue with that is that, as some of the speakers have mentioned, is that once a global shock happens, now many countries prioritize their own national interests. So many exporters actually will store more fuel for themselves, or many countries will store PPE for themselves. Now, if we do not have enough stock, Then another issue is that if we want to buy, we are either buy overpriced, but we are also a small consumer market compared to Northern America. So if I'm an exporter, which one would I prefer to send my goods to? And that is exactly what happened during COVID. So the exporters from China preferred Northern American markets. So absolutely, for fuel, at least we can have buffers. We should have buffers. For essential for supply chains, fueling and energy, we should have buffers. But then again, I think we need to also look into the policy making.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Panayotov, Independent Center for Analysis and Research of Economies, and I am creator of the Panayotov Matrix, which is a tool for establishing causality for social impacts. And this is the area of my expertise: impact assessment, social impact assessment, health impact assessment. I would like to make one important point, that when we speak about on average, like for example, the last Diana, she says that on average there is not a big issue with cost of living. Elon Musk has 1 trillion. I have 1,000, so we are billionaires. On average is very misleading, and I did put this in a paper in 2009. So I want to say that for me the most important and valuable presentation was on Viet Nguyen, because he was talking for distribution among different population groups, given that any policy or investment will have social impacts. They are always differential. If we do not identify those impacts, assess them properly, and then address unintended negative impacts, then we will end up with growing inequalities. And this is regarding the measure with, for example, universal, when the previous government did give energy help support with $300 per household. Everybody got it, including billionaires, millionaires, and many did miss out.
So do you have a question? Is that directed at any?
The question is, how do we judge for fairness?
Who would you like to target that?
Anybody who thinks that they are able to answer. How do we judge for fairness? Because this is super important question in order to determine how we design policies in order to get proper results.
Roger or Viet, would either of you like to answer that?
Well, I guess fairness is obviously a subjective or concept, or at least there are different interpretations of it, as Viet showed in his presentation. But we tend to think about your access to economic resources, and the kind you were talking about. It's things like your income and wealth, and so I guess fairness would be based around some notion of a minimum acceptable living standard, or a maximum tolerable level of inequality. But obviously equity considerations loom very large in all government policy decision making.
Right, mate. John, did you?
Deanna's got a hand up.
Oh, Deanna, sorry, you want to respond?
Yeah. So we can track inequality, and we do, and so does the Reserve Bank. And in Australia, at least, we haven't actually seen a huge increase in inequality in the past 10 to 15 years. It hasn't been nearly to the same extent as the US, which has seen a big rise in inequality over that time. That's as measured by the Gini coefficient published by the World Equivalized Income Database. That's mostly on the income side, though. For wealth, it would be worse, but on all the measures that I have seen, it hasn't been as much of an increase in Australia over that same time compared to some of our other peers. So we do look at it, but at the same time, the Reserve Bank has to set policy for the average person. But I understand the concerns within that, and the Melbourne Institute does some really good work about, like what Roger was going through, about trying to figure out what's going on across the different income quintiles. Thanks.
Great. John, you have a question online.
Next online question, also from Lachlan Kerwood. This is a question for Sam Tsiaplis. Would a Taylor-style rule for fiscal policy, i.e. a fiscal policy equivalent of the Taylor rule with a fiscal rather than monetary policy reaction function targeting the inflation cap, help to anchor inflation expectations in concert with monetary policy? That question is for you, Sam Tsiaplis.
So I think the question is saying, if you engage in fiscal policy where you cut back spending in the presence of output and inflationary gaps, would that have ramifications for inflation expectations? Well, it probably would, because if your fiscal policy was very much constructed in that fashion, that would have inflationary impacts. Obviously, fiscal policy does impact on inflation. That's nothing new. We know that that's the case. So if fiscal policy was very much aligned with output and inflation gaps, then it probably is the case that that would influence inflation expectations. Would it anchor them? That's an open question. I think we'd need research on that, but yeah, I think at the margin it would certainly influence them.
Great, thank you very much. So we're right on time. Do you have a very, very quick question?
Short one.
Yeah, the short one.
Peter Jones, Stratford Advisory. Bank of England have found that 40% benefits of their QE program. Bank of England found that 40% of the benefits of their QE program went to the top 5% of households. Has the RBA done any similar work to assess how this skewed set of benefits has impacted both inflation and equality? And I always love coming to economic events when no one talks about QE as an inflationary measure. It's always amazing to see.
Who would you like to answer that?
I'm going to go for, unsurprisingly, the RBA's rep here today.
I'm going to actually, can I take that one offline, because there is some research done, but it's best to sort of refer you directly to the research that's been done and it's been published. So I'll get you details afterwards and give you the link. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's right on 12:30. We do have just a casual lunch outside, so please stay, have lunch, talk. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to ASA, the Academy of Social Sciences, who also partnered with us for this event. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you.